I was halfway through convincing Wolfe that the orchids wouldn't sulk if he let me open a window when the bell rang. Fritz padded out of the kitchen with a spoon in his hand, raised an eyebrow at me, and I took the hint. I went to the door, expecting a package or maybe Kramer looking for a fight, but instead I found a man who looked like his suit had been pressed while he was still inside it. His face was pale, but his voice tried to sell authority. "Mr. Wolfe," he said. "I need to speak to Mr. Wolfe." "Sure," I told him. "You and the rest of the borough, but come in and tell me if you're selling bonds, insurance, or just yourself." He stepped inside without smiling, which meant I wasn't going to like him. The smell of wet wool clung to his coat, and I figured the city had dumped another afternoon shower. He took a stiff glance around, as if he expected money to be nailed to the walls, and followed me to the office. Wolfe was in his chair, naturally, half turned toward the orchids as if their petals carried more weight than anything a human could produce. He swung his eyes over to us, dropped them on the man like 2 bricks, and said, "Your name?" "Edward Hayes." The man straightened his tie. "Vice President at Gotham National Bank." That got Wolfe's eyebrows to twitch, which, in his language, meant he'd heard something worth registering. "Your errand?" Wolfe's tone suggested he didn't expect it to be worth his time. Hayes hesitated, then glanced at me as if I were an obstacle, not an ally. "This is confidential." "Then you have erred," Wolfe said. "My assistant hears everything I hear. Say it, or go." I leaned against my desk corner, waiting for him to realize Wolfe had just pinned him. Hayes swallowed. "One of our senior partners, Mr. Paul Zimmerman, was found dead this morning. At his residence. It looks like suicide, but—" He cut himself off. I supplied the missing word. "But you don't buy it." Hayes ignored me. "Mr. Zimmerman managed accounts, significant ones, including my own, and yesterday evening I received documents suggesting that Zimmerman had been living a double life. The nature of it could ruin the bank if it comes out." Wolfe moved only enough to press his fingertips together. "The police?" "I can't go to them, not yet. I need discretion. If Zimmerman was killed, or if the documents are authentic, the implications are catastrophic. I came here because your reputation is—" He fumbled. "Unique." I was waiting for Wolfe to grunt him out of the room, but instead, Wolfe's eyes settled like stones in a pond. "Show me the documents." Hayes pulled an envelope from his inner pocket. His hand shook enough to betray nerves beneath the starch. He laid the envelope on Wolfe's desk like a tribute to a god, then took 2 steps back. I moved around and opened it before Wolfe had to soil his fingers. Inside were 4 bank statements, not all matching, Gotham National's style, and 2 photographs of Zimmerman in a neighborhood where people don't go to open accounts. One photo had him entering a dingy club with a woman who looked like she'd never seen the inside of a bank unless she was cashing a check she hadn't earned. I whistled low. Your partner knew how to diversify. Hayes bristled. This is no joke, Mr. Goodwin. If Zimmerman was embezzling— If, Wolfe repeated, his voice calm enough to quiet the air. If he was indeed living a double life, and if his death was not self-inflicted. You came to me because you cannot afford those questions answered in the wrong arena. Yes, Hayes said. I will pay whatever your fee requires. Just keep this away from the press. Keep it away from Kramer until we know. I expected Wolfe to dismiss him on principle. He didn't like bankers any more than he liked drafts. Instead, Wolfe inhaled, filling the room with the sound of his disapproval, and said, Archie, that meant me. Yeah? You will accompany Mr. Hayes to the coroner's office, obtain every detail, photographs, autopsy notes if possible, the official police line. And Archie, do not blunder. If the police scent interference, our task is crippled. Sure, I said. I'll tiptoe, like an elephant in socks. Hayes looked at me with something between horror and doubt, but Wolfe shut it down with a single, that will be all. Fritz beer. That ended Hayes's audience. Wolfe had accepted, though not out of compassion or greed. Something about the case tickled the beast in his brain. I could tell because he'd said yes before negotiating the fee. When he does that, it isn't business, it's sport. As Hayes left with me at his side, he muttered, "You think it's murder?" "I don't think anything until Wolfe tells me," I said. "But suicide or not, Zimmerman's little hobby spots are going to give us a lively tour. You ready to answer Wolfe's questions when he starts? Because, believe me, he will." We reached the curb. A drizzle streaked the lamps, and Hayes's driver hustled to open the car door. I climbed in after him. I didn't need Wolfe's brain to see what was coming: a dead banker, a trail of money, and a private life that had all the makings of a public scandal. Whether Zimmerman had pulled his own trigger or someone had helped him along, Wolfe was already hooked. That meant I was too, whether I liked bankers or not. I didn't have to work hard to keep Hayes from talking on the ride. He was wound tight enough that his mouth only opened when nerves squeezed it. When we reached the coroner's building, the drizzle had hardened into a slick sheet, turning the steps into a skating hazard. Hayes kept his jaw clenched as we climbed, like he thought slipping would make the case collapse along with his balance. I didn't help him. I had enough on my hands figuring out how to pry information from a coroner who didn't owe me favors. Inside, the lights glared too bright for the hour, and the linoleum smelled like someone had tried to mop guilt out of it. I led the way to the desk, asked for Dr. Macready, and got a slow once-over from the clerk before he buzzed us through. Macready was a wiry man with a mustache that looked like it had been pasted on for a bad stage play. He squinted at me, remembered a poker game 2 winters ago where he'd won $3 off me, and grinned. "Goodwin, still hanging around corpses for fun?" "Strictly professional this time," I told him. "Zimmerman, the banker who checked out this morning. What's the verdict?" Macready leaned back. "You and your boss don't waste time. Official line is suicide. Gunshot wound to the head. Revolver in his own hand. No signs of forced entry. Case closed if you ask the police." I glanced at Hayes. His lips compressed tighter. "That's not all," I said. Macready chuckled. "You never settle for the surface." "Fine. There were smudges on the revolver grip, but partial. His prints were there, but so was another set, faint. And the angle, well, if I were writing a novel, I'd call it awkward. Left temple, but Zimmerman was right-handed." "That awkwardness ever make it into your official report?" I asked. He spread his hands. "Police don't like ambiguity. Kramer was here. He saw the body. He'll file it as suicide unless pushed, and unless someone pushes hard, that's the end." Hayes cleared his throat. "Doctor, would you be willing to share the autopsy notes for confidential review?" Macready eyed him like he was asking to borrow his wife. "Confidential review, huh? I don't usually hand over paperwork to bankers, but for Archie, maybe I can manage a copy. You'll owe me, Goodwin." I nodded. "Add it to my tab. I'll settle it at the next poker game." Macready slid a manila folder across the table. I tucked it under my arm, gave him a thanks, and steered Hayes out before the man grew a conscience. Back in the car, Hayes finally burst. "This proves it. Someone killed Zimmerman. He wasn't the type to?" I cut him off. "Plenty of types surprise their friends when a bullet shows up. Don't sell Wolfe half-baked certainty. He won't buy it. What you've got is doubt, not proof." Hayes stiffened, but he shut up, which was fine with me. When we got back to the brownstone, Fritz met us at the door. He gave Hayes a look like he was deciding whether bankers were worse for the carpet than mud. Wolfe didn't wait for pleasantries. His voice carried from the office. "Archie." I delivered the folder to his desk. Wolfe opened it with the care of a man unwrapping a cigar he suspected might be counterfeit. His eyes flicked over the pages, slow and deliberate. Then he closed it and leaned back. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "the evidence is ambiguous. Suicide or murder, neither is established. What is established is that your partner maintained two lives, one public, respectable, profitable, one private, sordid, costly. That alone is a motive for either self-destruction or the provocation of another's hand. Hayes's face twitched. I knew nothing of it. Nothing. Zimmerman handled accounts with discretion. I trusted him completely. "Für," Wolfe said softly. "You trusted him because it suited you. Men like Zimmerman prosper because their colleagues prefer ignorance to inquiry. That you now discover his duplicity is not exculpation, it is merely belated." Hayes flushed. "You must understand, the board, the investors. If this becomes public, Gotham National collapses." "That," Wolfe replied, "is not my concern. I will inquire. But understand this, Mr. Hayes. If you have not been candid with me, if you have withheld a fact, you will regret it. Archie, sit." I sat. Wolfe fixed Hayes with the look he usually reserved for wilted orchids. "Zimmerman's other life. What did it consist of?" "I told you, I don't know," Hayes said, too quick. "Then we will discover," Wolfe murmured. "Archie, tomorrow you will visit Zimmerman's residence. Inspect it. Bring back any correspondence, photographs, or items that betray his extracurricular diversions. Also, visit the club shown in the photographs." Hayes paled. "That club?" "Yes?" Wolfe prompted. "It's disreputable," Hayes said. "The sort of place where the police turn a blind eye for the right price." "All the more reason you will not go, and Archie will," Wolfe replied. "Leave the photographs here." Hayes handed them over like they were burning. Wolfe tucked them neatly beside the folder. "You may go," Wolfe said. Hayes bristled. "That's it. You'll find who killed him." "If he was killed, yes. If he killed himself, I will find that too. Both conclusions are possible. You will be informed when certainty emerges. Good evening." Fritz was already waiting to usher him out. When the door closed, Wolfe sighed, reached for a bottle of beer, and looked at me. "Archie." "Yes, sir." "This case is offensive." I grinned. Bankers usually are. "No," Wolfe said. "Offensive because it presumes upon my tolerance. A man who bifurcates his existence, straddling two incompatible lives, invites destruction. But whether Zimmerman delivered it to himself or received it, we shall see. Go. Arrange your visits. Report tomorrow." That was Wolfe for you. He'd already mapped the lines before I'd sharpened a pencil. I was on the hook for Zimmerman's private playgrounds, and judging from the photos, they wouldn't be the kind of places where you ask politely for answers. I went upstairs, called Saul Panzer, and gave him a light outline, just in case. When bankers start bleeding secrets, you want Saul in your corner. By the time I turned in, Wolfe was still in the office, sipping beer and staring at the folder like it was daring him to blink first. If Zimmerman thought he could live two lives without Wolfe unbraiding them, he hadn't known Nero Wolfe at all. The photographs Wolfe had kept on his desk were still there the next morning when I came down, meaning he'd spent the night staring at them instead of sleeping. Fritz told me Wolfe hadn't touched breakfast until 11, which was normal, but the fact he'd been in the office since dawn wasn't. I didn't bother asking him if he'd had revelations during the night. If Wolfe wanted to share, he would. And if he didn't, I'd have to wait until he felt like being dramatic. I was already dressed for legwork, which in this case meant a suit tough enough to handle both bankers' widows and nightclubs that smelled like regret. Wolfe gave me a nod without looking up from his beer. That was as close to good luck as he ever got. Zimmerman's townhouse was in a neighborhood where wealth liked to pretend it was invisible. The doorman recognized me after I flashed the right smile and didn't make a fuss when I said I was handling arrangements for the estate. Money gets you through doors, but attitude does the rest, and mine usually works. Inside, the place had the neatness of someone who paid others to care. But it was too neat. I started in the study. The bookshelves were lined with financial histories and bound ledgers, all impressive and all dull. What wasn't dull was the desk drawer that contained a passport with stamps from countries where you don't go for the beaches, a set of keys not labeled for any Gotham property, and a handwritten note that read only, "Wednesday, same place. Don't be late." That had promise. I bagged the note and keys, made a mental mark on the passport, and moved upstairs. The bedroom was a shrine to someone who wanted to be thought orderly, but a hidden compartment in the closet behind the suits held a box of photographs. Wolfe could have spent a month on them. Most were women, none of them respectable, and at least 2 were the type to leave you wondering how much their smiles had cost Zimmerman. One photo, though, froze me. Zimmerman wasn't with a woman. He was shaking hands with a man I recognized. Victor Talbot, another Gotham national executive. I knew Talbot. He was younger than Zimmerman, hungry, and liked to wear ties that screamed louder than his voice. If Zimmerman's secret life crossed paths with Talbot, Wolfe would want that planted on his desk. I tucked the box back, took only the incriminating shot, and locked the closet again. On my way out, the doorman gave me a look like he knew I hadn't come for estate planning. I smiled my best and moved on. The club in the photo was in Midtown, a place where velvet curtains tried to smother the smell of smoke and desperation. I went in just before noon, which is when clubs look even dirtier than they do at night. The bartender squinted at me like I was the wrong type, but I ordered a ginger ale and slid him Zimmerman's photo with the brunette. "Seen him here?" I asked. The bartender smirked. "Sure, banker type. Came in regular, sat in the back, never drank more than 2, always with a different girl. You a cop?" "Nope. Cops don't tip this big." I let a bill do the convincing. He pocketed it. "Then I'll tell you. He was in last week, met a guy, not a girl. Tall, light suit, flashy tie. They talked in the back for an hour, then left together." "Name?" I asked. Didn't ask, didn't hear. But the tie, I'd know it anywhere. That made me grin. "Was it orange with stripes?" "Yeah." That clinched Talbot. I thanked him, drained the ginger ale, and left before I could be mistaken for someone recruiting talent. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe had demolished a plate of Fritz's veal and was pretending to be interested in the orchids. I unloaded the note, the keys, the passport, the photographs, and the Talbot connection. Wolfe grunted at intervals, which in his vocabulary meant I wasn't wasting his time. When I showed him the photograph of Zimmerman and Talbot, Wolfe's lips compressed. He laid it on the desk, tapped it once, and said, "So, that." "Talbot," I said. "Looks like they weren't just colleagues." Indeed. A man like Zimmerman does not jeopardize his concealment by mingling his lives unless necessity dictates. That photograph is necessity. Talbot's hunger, Zimmerman's duplicity, they intersect. "Could be motive," I said. "Maybe Zimmerman cut Talbot in. Maybe Talbot wanted more." Wolfe closed his eyes, which meant he was weighing. When he opened them, they settled like anvils. "Archie, fetch Mr. Talbot. Do not inform him why. Merely request his presence this evening, and call Mr. Hayes. He will attend as well." I raised a brow. "You starting the parade early?" "Not yet. I wish to observe them together." That was Wolfe's way. Bring suspects into the room before they realized it was a trap, and let his silence make them squirm. I phoned Hayes first. He sounded reluctant, but agreed. Talbot was harder. He bristled when I asked him to come. But I pressed the right button. "Zimmerman's estate may concern you." And he thawed enough to promise he'd show. After I hung up, I asked Wolfe, "What about the note?" "Wednesday, same place." That could mean anything. Wolfe tapped the desk. It could mean everything. If Zimmerman had a rendezvous arranged, it implies he expected to be alive. Ergo, suicide becomes less probable. "That's a neat ergo," I said. Wolfe's eyes flicked up. Neatness, Archie, is the marrow of deduction. Disorder is merely camouflage for the truth. Tonight, we begin to peel. Which meant Fritz had to add another bottle of beer to the evening's supply, and I had to polish my shoes. When bankers and their hungry colleagues came calling, you wanted to look like you belonged, even if you were only there to keep them from bolting. I'd just finished straightening my tie when the bell rang again. Fritz answered, but it wasn't Hayes or Talbot. It was Inspector Kramer, looking like a man who'd chewed tobacco laced with vinegar. He stomped into the office without waiting for permission. "Wolfe," he barked, "you're sniffing around Zimmerman. I don't like it." Wolfe didn't look up from his chair. "Then, Mr. Kramer, avert your nose. Your displeasure is irrelevant." Kramer slammed a palm on the desk. "Don't play games. Zimmerman's death is suicide, and I don't want you muddying it up. If you've got something, you bring it to me." I leaned back and smiled. "You should know by now, Inspector. Wolfe doesn't muddy. He clarifies. Sometimes the mud just doesn't like being exposed." Kramer growled. "Watch yourself, Goodwin. And you, Wolfe. If you drag in suspects without telling me, I'll shut you down." "Pfui," Wolfe said, calm as cream. "If you wish to stop me, you may attempt. Now remove yourself. Mr. Goodwin and I have an evening to arrange." Kramer muttered something unfit for polite company, turned, and stormed out. Fritz closed the door behind him with the kind of dignity only Fritz could manage. Wolfe looked at me. "You see, the inspector's bluster confirms our path. Proceed." And that was the beat where the evening ahead promised fireworks. 2 bankers, one dead, one nervous, and one ambitious, all converging in Wolfe's office. It was only a matter of time before the double life unraveled into single, naked truth. Hayes arrived first, a little past 7, carrying himself like a man who wanted the walls to vouch for him. Fritz relieved him of his coat, and Hayes stepped into the office with the stiffness of someone about to testify under oath. Wolfe didn't rise, naturally, but acknowledged him with a tilt of his head and gestured toward the red leather chair across from the desk. Hayes sat and clasped his hands so tightly his knuckles blanched. 10 minutes later, the bell rang again, and this time it was Talbot. He looked as if he'd come straight from a board meeting. Shiny shoes, loud tie, hair slicked back as if he expected flash bulbs. He had the confidence of a man who hadn't yet learned it was a liability. When he entered the office and saw Hayes already there, the confidence cracked for just a second before he reset it with a grin. "Well," Talbot said, "I didn't know this was going to be a party." "It isn't," Wolfe replied. "It is an inquiry." Talbot dropped into the nearest chair and crossed his legs, flashing the tie I'd seen in the photo. Wolfe let the silence stretch until even I began to feel it. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Zimmerman led 2 lives. One was yours, Mr. Hayes, professional and orderly. The other was dissolute, clandestine, and dangerous. I require clarity about how these 2 intersected." Hayes shifted. "I told you yesterday. I knew nothing of it." "And you expect me to believe," Wolfe said, his tone mild but sharp as a cleaver, "that a senior partner at Gotham National could maintain 2 existences without any whiff of it crossing your nostrils?" "Pfui." Talbot laughed too loud. "You're wasting your time, Wolfe. Zimmerman fooled a lot of people. That doesn't make us accomplices." "Perhaps," Wolfe said. "But your mirth is ill-placed, Mr. Talbot. Zimmerman's duplicity endangered the bank. That alone is sufficient motive for discontent. And you, sir, were seen in his company outside the bank." Talbot's grin slipped. "Seen by who?" I slid the photograph across the desk. Talbot stiffened when he saw it. Zimmerman and him shaking hands outside the club. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow. "Business?" he said. "Zimmerman was helping me explore some alternative investments. Nothing illegal, nothing relevant." Hayes's head snapped toward him. Alternative investments. You never mentioned—" "Shut up," Talbot hissed. "Ah," Wolfe murmured. "So Mr. Zimmerman's shadow life touched you as well. You see, Mr. Hayes, denial collapses swiftly when tested." Hayes looked stricken. "I had no idea." "Of course not," Wolfe said. "Ignorance is your armor, but it is perforated." He turned his gaze back to Talbot. "Zimmerman was scheduled to meet someone last Wednesday. Were you the someone?" Talbot bristled. "I don't know what you're talking about." Wolfe's eyes closed for a long moment, then opened with finality. "Archie." I caught the cue. "Talbot, the bartender at the club, remembers you. Stripes and all. You met Zimmerman there last week. He remembers you leaving together." Talbot's lips pressed into a thin line. "Fine. Yes, we met. Zimmerman was jumpy. He said he had debts. He asked if I could connect him with people. I told him no. That's all." "That's all?" Wolfe asked. "Yet Zimmerman died days later. Convenient." "It had nothing to do with me," Talbot snapped. "I didn't kill him." "No?" Wolfe said, unruffled. "Then perhaps you can tell us who did." Talbot shifted uncomfortably. Hayes stared at him like a man realizing his entire career might have been balanced on the wrong partner's shoulders. The room was thick with silence again until Fritz entered, discreet as always, with the evening's beer. Wolfe accepted it, sipped, and let the pause swell. Finally he spoke, his voice even. "You both will leave now. I've heard what I wished. Mr. Goodwin will escort you." They didn't argue. Hayes rose first, pale, his eyes darting between Wolfe and Talbot as if trying to measure which one he feared more. Talbot followed, his swagger bruised but not gone. I showed them both out and returned to the office, where Wolfe sat as if he hadn't moved. "Well?" I asked. "Both men are liars," Wolfe said calmly. "But only one is desperate." "Talbot?" I guessed. Wolfe inclined his head. "He blusters, but Hayes, his silence spoke more eloquently than Talbot's evasions. A man who truly knew nothing would rage. He did not. He trembled." I perched on the desk. "So what's next?" "Zimmerman's other keys," Wolfe said. "Where do they lead? That, Archie, is your errand tomorrow. They may open doors that reveal which man benefited from Zimmerman's ruin. Until then, we wait." Waiting wasn't my specialty, but Wolfe had declared it with such finality that arguing would have been as useful as telling the rain not to fall. I leaned back and tried to picture the banker's double life, split neatly between ledgers and shadows, and wondered which of the men I'd just escorted out had shoved him off balance until he fell. Later that night, I made another call to Saul Panzer. If those keys belonged to safe deposit boxes, storage rooms, or hidden apartments, Saul's nose for trails would keep me from wasting half a week. Saul agreed to meet me in the morning. By the time I hung up, Wolfe was already closing his eyes in the chair, lips moving faintly as if savoring some silent conclusion. He hadn't given it to me yet, but I knew he had one brewing. Wolfe never admitted it, but once he tasted a pattern, he couldn't let it go until he'd pinned it flat, which left me staring at the keys on his desk, gleaming under the lamp, and wondering just what Zimmerman had locked away that was worth dying or killing for. The next morning, Saul and I met on West 34th, a block from where Zimmerman's address book said nothing but the keys in my pocket insisted otherwise. Saul had his usual get-up, quiet shoes, forgettable hat, expression that said he'd seen everything twice and didn't plan to brag about it. He nodded at me, then at the locksmith's tag I'd traced to this block. "Third key's cut for these buildings," he said. "Old Yale tumbler. Should slide in without fuss." That was Saul. No build-up, no flourish, just straight to the vein. We started with the dingy 4-story on the corner. First floor was a grocer, second and third smelled like cabbage, and the fourth was locked. The key slid in smooth, like Saul predicted. Inside was one room, maybe 12 feet by 12, with peeling wallpaper and a single table in the center. On the table sat a metal cash box. I closed the door and locked it behind us before we touched anything. Saul stood guard at the window while I tried the other keys. The third one clicked the box open. Inside were bundles of papers, some stapled, some loose. I flipped through them and felt my pulse quicken. These weren't grocery lists. They were account ledgers, names, deposits, withdrawals, all under Zimmerman's hand. Some bore Gotham National's letterhead. Others were on stationery from outfits I wouldn't trust to hold a piggy bank. More interesting were the notes paper-clipped to a few sheets. Names again, but with initials beside them, E.H., V.T., and once, scrawled in red ink, Balance Owed, Wednesday. I didn't need Wolfe's vocabulary to translate. Zimmerman had been running a parallel set of books, a shadow bank where certain clients could tuck away money with no official eyes watching. That meant blackmail, embezzlement, or both. And the initials, if they were what I thought they were, Hayes and Talbot had their accounts balanced right alongside. I whistled. Saul came over, peered at the ledgers, and gave a low grunt. For him, that was a full brass band. We packed the papers carefully, locked the room and split. Saul off in one direction to cover our tracks, me back to the brownstone with the box under my arm like it was dynamite. Wolfe barely moved when I set it on his desk. He finished his glass of beer, wiped his lips, and then let his eyes drop to the box. I opened it and handed him the ledgers. He leafed through them with the same detachment he might have shown a menu. Only when he reached the notes with the initials did he grunt, deep and final. "Mr. Hayes and Mr. Talbot," he said. "Their complicity is inscribed. Whether willing or coerced, they are entangled." "Entangled enough to kill Zimmerman?" I asked. "Perhaps. The question is whether they feared his exposure or coveted his spoils. Both are deadly motives." Wolfe leaned back, fingers steepled. "Archie, telephone Inspector Kramer. Inform him I require his presence here this evening. We shall test these men against the weight of evidence." I didn't envy Kramer, but I made the call. He barked, swore, and said he'd be there. By 8 that night, the office had the kind of tension you could slice with Fritz's carving knife. Hayes sat stiff, his face pale, but his jaw set. Talbot looked like he was rehearsing lines for a jury. Kramer occupied the red chair, chewing his cigar and glaring at Wolfe as if the orchids had committed murder. Wolfe sat, monumental, the ledgers before him. "Gentlemen," Wolfe began, "Mr. Zimmerman lived a double life. These ledgers record it. He conducted business beyond the bank's purview, business that involved you, Mr. Hayes, and you, Mr. Talbot." Hayes blurted, "That's impossible." But Wolfe cut him off with a single, raised hand. Impossible, yet true. These initials coincide with sums unaccounted for, and this notation, Wednesday, balance owed, suggests a rendezvous. Zimmerman did not plan to die. He planned to collect. Talbot shifted in his chair. "So he was crooked. That doesn't make me guilty of anything." "Doesn't it?" Wolfe said smoothly. "You met him last week at the club. You admit as much. Did he not press you for payment?" "I told you," Talbot snapped. "He asked for help with debts." I said no. "And yet you went with him after. Why?" Wolfe's voice was soft, but the question struck hard. Talbot floundered, then settled into defiance. Personal reasons. Kramer barked, "You'll explain those personal reasons down at headquarters if you don't talk here." Hayes finally spoke, his voice brittle. "I had nothing to do with Zimmerman's private accounts. If he used my initials, it was without my consent." "Pfui," Wolfe muttered. "Your fear betrays you. You tremble not from innocence, but from exposure. Zimmerman's death spared you scandal, but it also left you vulnerable. If these ledgers surfaced, your career, your bank, would be ruined." Motive enough. Hayes stood indignant. You can't accuse me without proof. Sit, Wolfe said, and the command landed like a stone. Hayes sat. Wolfe's eyes moved to Talbot. And you, Mr. Talbot. Ambition propels you. Zimmerman's duplicity offered leverage. His death removes a superior and leaves you unencumbered. Motive enough. The silence stretched. Fritz entered, set down beer, and withdrew. Wolfe didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He only let the words linger until they pressed against the walls. Finally, he turned to Kramer. Inspector, you have heard. Both men had cause, and both men lied. The decisive question is, who was with Zimmerman at the hour of his death? Kramer grunted. We got no witnesses. Door was locked, gun in his hand. Looked clean. Looked, Wolfe echoed. But was not. The revolver bore smudged prints, partial, but not exclusively Zimmerman's. Archie, show the inspector the notes. I handed them over. Kramer read, scowled, and chewed harder. Hell, if this is real, it blows the whole suicide story apart. It is real, Wolfe said. Mr. Zimmerman's second life was his undoing. Whether by his own despair or another's hand, these accounts condemned him. Inspector, confine both men. Their reactions under pressure will reveal the guilty hand. Kramer muttered, Damn you, Wolfe. But he stood. Hayes protested. Talbot cursed. But 2 uniforms were waiting in the hall. I'd tipped off Kramer's men in advance. They took both bankers, sputtering, out into the night. When the door shut, Wolfe exhaled, reached for his beer, and finally leaned back. Archie, he said, bring me the photograph again. I did. He stared at it, Zimmerman and Talbot clasping hands outside the club, and murmured, Duplicitous men always reveal themselves when they think they are concealed. Tomorrow, Archie, we shall sift the rest. Tonight, let the police simmer. He closed his eyes, and I sat back, listening to the echo of footsteps fading down the street. Zimmerman's double life wasn't a secret anymore. It was a fuse burning straight towards someone's undoing. Kramer's men had barely dragged Hayes and Talbot out the door when Wolfe closed his eyes, as if the evening had been more tedious than enlightening. I stayed put, waiting to see if he'd drop a pearl of wisdom or just snore. After half a minute, he opened them again, aimed them at me, and said, Pfui. Both of them squirm, but neither yet breaks. We require more. That's always the problem, I said. Squirming doesn't tell us who pulled the trigger. Zimmerman's death may have saved them both, so they both had motive. What now? Wolfe gestured at the ledgers. Now, Archie, you will trace these accounts. Saul will assist. Somewhere among the balances lies a misstep, an inconsistency that will betray the hand of the killer. Tracing phantom accounts, I said. Sure, I'll just walk into every shady outfit in the city and ask politely who's been skimming. Should take me all week. Pfui, Wolfe repeated. You exaggerate. Saul has avenues. You will employ them. I phoned Saul again that night. By dawn, he had already mapped half the initials in the ledgers to front companies that smelled of mildew and laundered cash. By mid-morning, we met in a diner off Lexington, and he slid me a page of notes in his neat block handwriting. 3 names, 3 addresses, 3 discrepancies. One account had deposits far higher than the withdrawals justified. Another had been abruptly closed the day before Zimmerman's death. The third bore the name E.H., but had a withdrawal signed by initials that looked more like V.T. I pocketed the notes, thanked Saul, and promised to put them in Wolfe's lap before the eggs on his breakfast plate cooled. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was already at the table with Fritz's eggs and a pile of toast that could have fed a regiment. I delivered Saul's findings. Wolfe dabbed his lips, pushed the plate away, and read. His brows lifted, then descended into the scowl that meant the case was beginning to amuse him. So, he said, Mr. Zimmerman kept parallel accounts not merely for vice, but for advantage. He leveraged Mr. Hayes's standing to conceal and Mr. Talbot's hunger to expand. But one of them faltered. That is the fisher. Talbot's the flashy one, I said. Hayes is too nervous to scheme big. My money says Talbot. Your money, Wolfe said dryly, is not evidence. I shrugged. No, but sometimes a gut knows more than a ledger. Wolfe ignored me, which wasn't new. We must test them again, but not here. Archie, arrange for Mr. Hayes and Mr. Talbot to be released from custody. Kramer will howl, but tell him I demand it. Tonight they will both come, and they will face the ledgers once more. It took 3 calls to Kramer before he agreed. The third one included language not suitable for Fritz's ears, but eventually he spat that I could have my way. By evening, both bankers were back in our office, looking like 2 schoolboys who'd been kept after class. Hayes was pale and tight-lipped, Talbot restless and defiant. Wolfe had arranged the ledgers across his desk in precise rows. He didn't glance at them. He glanced at me. Proceed. I opened the cash box, pulled the ledger with the conflicting signatures, and set it before Talbot. Recognize your handiwork. Talbot leaned forward, squinted, and shook his head. That's not mine. Of course not, Wolfe murmured. It is not your handwriting, but the sum withdrawn is yours, Mr. Talbot. $50,000. Signed out under Mr. Hayes's initials. Curious, is it not? Hayes's head jerked. That's absurd. I never signed anything. Yet here it is, Wolfe said. Zimmerman was many things, but careless he was not. If the withdrawal bore false initials, he permitted it, which means he trusted the man who signed. The question is, why, and why, days later, was Zimmerman dead? Talbot scowled. He was playing both sides. Maybe he wanted leverage over Hayes, maybe over me. I don't know, but I didn't kill him. Wolfe let silence spool until Talbot squirmed. Then he turned his eyes on Hayes. And you, sir? Your denial is shrill, but shrillness does not erase fact. If Zimmerman permitted Mr. Talbot to sign in your stead, what was the bargain? Hayes's face turned red. I had nothing to do with Zimmerman's schemes. He betrayed me as much as anyone. No, Wolfe said, calm as cream. He shielded you, until he no longer could. That is the crux. When a man who has hidden your complicity threatens exposure, desperation follows, and desperation is the truest motive for murder. Hayes shot up from the chair. I've had enough of this. Sit, Wolfe commanded, and Hayes sat, as if the word itself carried weight. Kramer, in the corner, chewed his cigar like it was the throat of the case. I don't see proof, Wolfe. I see a tangle. You're pointing at both of them. Indeed, Wolfe said. Because both are guilty of deceit, of embezzlement, of cowardice. But only one of them took Zimmerman's life, and that fact, Inspector, will reveal itself when I test them with a single truth they cannot dodge. Tonight, we are close. Talbot slammed his fist. You can't keep dragging us in here like criminals. On the contrary, Wolfe said, I must. For one of you is a murderer, and the other a fool. By tomorrow, Inspector, you will know which is which. Kramer growled, but he stayed put, because he knew Wolfe well enough to recognize when the hook was already set. The room simmered with tension. Fritz entered quietly, collected the empty glasses, and left without a word. Wolfe finally leaned back, folded his hands across his middle, and closed his eyes. Archie, he murmured, tomorrow you will revisit the club. Ask again. Zimmerman's last hours must be placed in full light. Then, return here. The pattern is nearly complete. That was Wolfe's version of saying the net was tightening. I'd seen it enough to know when he was within striking distance. The only thing left was to see which banker would break first when the trap finally shut. The club looked different in the morning light, stripped of its velvet pretense and showing all the cracks in its plaster. The bartender was the same, though, thick-shouldered, thinning hair, and the kind of expression that said he'd seen enough drunks to last a lifetime. He recognized me, narrowed his eyes, and then went back to polishing glasses like the act itself could erase questions. I slid Zimmerman's photo across the counter again. We talked last time. You remember what you told me? Zimmerman met someone in the back. Tall, flashy tie. They talked, left together. You didn't tell me everything. The bartender smirked. I told you what I knew. Maybe, I said, lowering my voice. But maybe I didn't press hard enough. This time I'm pressing. What did Zimmerman say that night? The man hesitated, then shrugged. He was nervous, kept looking over his shoulder, said something about owing more than he could cover. The guy with him, the one in the tie, kept saying he'd handle it, but Zimmerman had to keep quiet. That's all I heard. Handle it how? He shook his head. Didn't say. But I saw something else. When they left, the banker didn't look relieved. He looked worse, like he knew he'd signed his own warrant. That was enough to make me thank him with another bill and head out. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair with the ledgers spread like an emperor's map. He barely glanced up when I came in. I dropped the report in his lap. Zimmerman owed more than he could cover, I said. And Talbot told him he'd handle it if Zimmerman stayed quiet. That sound like a rescue to you? On the contrary, Wolfe said, eyes half closed. It sounds like coercion. Mr. Talbot could not afford Zimmerman's exposure. If Zimmerman grew nervous, if he threatened disclosure, then Mr. Talbot's only means of handling it was to silence him. Then it's Talbot, I said. We're done. No, Wolfe said, his tone flat as iron. Mr. Hayes yet looms. Fear, Archie, is a potent catalyst. Mr. Hayes may have killed to prevent discovery. Mr. Talbot may have killed to seize advantage. Both had reason. Both had opportunity. I dropped into my chair. So we're back where we started. 2 men, 1 corpse, no certainty. Phooey, Wolfe said. We are not where we started. We are precisely where we must be before the denouement. Tomorrow evening we shall convene all concerned parties here, including the inspector. Then the strands will be drawn tight. That was Wolfe's way of saying he already knew the answer, but wasn't ready to unwrap it for me yet. That night, Fritz served squab stuffed with mushrooms, but Wolfe's appetite was smaller than usual. He ate half, drank 2 beers instead of 3, and then sat in silence so heavy the orchids might have wilted. When he finally spoke, it was only 1 word. Tomorrow. The next day was a waiting game, which isn't my strong suit. I made calls, checked in with Saul, who had nothing new but confirmed Talbot had recently paid off a suspiciously large personal loan, and by dusk I was more wound up than the bankers ever were. Wolfe, of course, was immovable, perched in his chair with the serenity of a man who could outstare stone. By 8 sharp, the room was full. Hayes and Talbot again, both under protest, Kramer scowling like a thunderhead, Fritz hovering in the doorway. Wolfe let them sit, let the silence grow until it was unbearable. Then, finally, he began. Gentlemen, Mr. Zimmerman's death was not suicide. The evidence of angle, prints, and circumstance precludes it. He was killed. The question is by which of you? Talbot sneered. You can't pin this on me. Nor on me, Hayes added quickly, voice taut. Indeed, Wolfe said. Not both, only one. He tapped the ledger. Mr. Zimmerman's shadow accounts reveal embezzlement. Mr. Talbot, your signature appears under Mr. Hayes's initials, withdrawing funds not your own. A fraud, permissible only because Zimmerman allowed it. He permitted it because you were already entangled. Mr. Hayes, your position lent credibility. Mr. Talbot, your ambition lent hunger. Both of you relied upon Zimmerman's duplicity. Both had cause to wish him gone. But cause is not guilt. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, the most movement he'd shown in hours. Archie. I opened the cash box, pulled out the note. Wednesday, same place. Don't be late," and held it up. This, Wolfe said, was Zimmerman's own hand. A rendezvous scheduled. He did not intend death. He intended collection, and the man he meant to meet was the same man who now insists he is innocent. Hayes shifted uneasily. "That doesn't prove it was me." "No," Wolfe said, "but your fear does. You sought to deny knowledge of Zimmerman's other life, yet the ledgers show otherwise. Still, you would not have met him in such a place, nor at such an hour. Your temperament forbids it. Mr. Talbot, however, would. He did. He met Zimmerman that night. He promised to handle it. And indeed he did, by placing a revolver in Zimmerman's hand, angling it against his temple, and pulling the trigger. The awkward placement, the smudged prints. Yours, Mr. Talbot, confirm it." Talbot exploded. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Wolfe's voice didn't rise. "The bartender saw you. The debts confirm it. The forged withdrawals prove you are siphoning funds under Mr. Hayes's cover. Zimmerman threatened exposure. You silenced him. It is inevitable." Kramer rose, chewing his cigar like it was fresh meat. "That's enough. Talbot, you're coming with me." Talbot shouted protests, but the uniforms were already at the door. They closed on him, wrestled him out, his tie flaring like a flag of surrender. The room fell silent again. Hayes sagged in his chair, pale with relief. Wolfe leaned back, shut his eyes, and murmured. So, one life ended, another spared. Yet both were corrupt. "Mr. Hayes, Gotham National is yours to defend. See that you do not repeat Mr. Zimmerman's folly." Hayes tried to speak, failed, and left quietly. Kramer lingered, glaring at Wolfe. "You got your man, but you'll never stop meddling, will you?" Wolfe opened his eyes, heavy-lidded. "No, Inspector, never, because men will always deceive, and deception is my provender." Kramer growled and left, slamming the door. When the sound faded, I looked at Wolfe. So Talbot it was. I'll admit, you had me guessing till the end. Wolfe sighed, reached for his beer, and said, "Archie, I never guess." After Kramer and his men carted Talbot away, the brownstone fell back into that thick silence that Wolfe wears like a robe. Fritz cleared the glasses, his movements as quiet as a prayer, and disappeared into the kitchen. Wolfe sat immobile, his eyes closed, as if the evening had been little more than an intrusion into his digestion. I perched on the edge of my desk, waiting for him to either grunt out the final word or drift off into one of his sulks. But Wolfe didn't sleep. He opened his eyes, slow and heavy, and regarded me. "Archie, the matter is not concluded." That surprised me. "Talbot shot Zimmerman, didn't he?" "Case closed." "Pfui, you're too facile." "Yes, Talbot killed Zimmerman, but the rot runs deeper. Mr. Zimmerman's double life was not his alone. It was nurtured, permitted, and concealed. We must ask why." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Because he was clever enough to pull it off, and cowardly enough not to stop. Isn't that why?" Wolfe shook his head slightly. "No. Such duplicity thrives only in soil prepared for it. Someone enabled Zimmerman. Someone profited even more than he did. Talbot was merely the hand that pulled the trigger. We must identify the mind that created the necessity." That gave me pause. I'd been ready to close the book, but Wolfe never let a case end until every thread was tied. He was right. Zimmerman hadn't been juggling two lives just for the fun of it. He'd been part of something wider, and if Talbot's ambition drove him to murder, then someone else had given him the opportunity to feed. I thought of Hayes, his pallor, his tremors, his insistence on ignorance. Wolfe had skewered him with silence, but hadn't finished him off. "You're thinking Hayes," I said. Wolfe's eyes glinted. Of course. Hayes presented himself as a victim, yet he summoned us with an urgency born not of altruism, but of fear. His protestations were too rehearsed. He knew. I frowned. If he knew, why bring us in? Wouldn't that risk more exposure? It would, Wolfe said, unless he sought to control the exposure. By steering me, he could hope to direct suspicion away from himself. But his error was in assuming that I could be steered. I grinned. That's an error a lot of people make. Wolfe ignored me. He reached for his beer, sipped, and then set it down. Tomorrow evening, Mr. Hayes returns, and this time he will not leave untouched. The next day was a parade of phone calls. Kramer rang twice, demanding to know why Wolfe insisted on dragging Hayes back when Talbot was already booked in the system. Wolfe listened to the rant with his eyes closed and cut him off with a single sentence. Because Mr. Hayes is not absolved. That was enough to send Kramer into apoplexy, but he agreed to come, if only to witness Wolfe crash and burn. I phoned Hayes myself. His voice on the line was thin, quivering, but when I told him Wolfe required his presence, he didn't refuse. Maybe he knew better, or maybe he was too scared not to come. When evening rolled around again, the office felt heavy. The orchids in the corner seemed to lean closer, as if they were waiting for Wolfe's judgment. Fritz stood by the door, silent sentinel, while Kramer sulked in the red leather chair, puffing his cigar like a man preparing for a hanging. At 8 sharp, Hayes walked in. He looked worse than before. His suit was the same cut, but it hung looser, and his eyes were shadowed. Fritz took his coat, and Hayes stepped into the lion's den like a man resigned. Wolfe didn't bother greeting him. He only gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. Hayes sat, clasping his hands again, those pale knuckles white as chalk. "Mr. Hayes," Wolfe began, "you are not yet released." Hayes licked his lips. I told you everything I knew. Talbot killed him. You proved it. Why am I here?" "Because your claim of ignorance is false," Wolfe said calmly. "You knew of Zimmerman's second life. You profited from it." Hayes flinched. "That's not true." "Pfui," Wolfe cut him off. "These ledgers show accounts under your initials. Zimmerman shielded you, but he did not invent you. He exploited your position to conceal his fraud, and you allowed it. Perhaps reluctantly, perhaps under duress, but allowed nonetheless." Kramer growled. "Wolfe, we already got Talbot. Don't try to muddy it again." "Be silent," Wolfe said without looking at him. "Archie." That was my cue. I opened the cash box and slid a separate ledger across to Wolfe. He tapped one page with his finger. "This withdrawal, marked with your initials. Mr. Hayes, $100,000. Yet the funds never reached Zimmerman's accounts. Where did they go?" Hayes's face crumpled. I don't know. Zimmerman handled everything." "No," Wolfe said, voice sharp as a knife. "You handled it. The money disappeared into an account beyond Zimmerman's reach. You betrayed him before he betrayed you. That is why you feared discovery. That is why you trembled in this room." The silence pressed in. Kramer scowled but said nothing. Fritz didn't move. Finally, Hayes whispered, "I couldn't stop it. Zimmerman forced me, threatened the bank, threatened me. I signed what he asked, but I didn't kill him." "Swear I didn't kill him." "No," Wolfe said, leaning back. "You did not kill him. But you are guilty nonetheless, guilty of cowardice, of collusion, of complicity. Without you, Zimmerman's double life could not have flourished. You are the soil from which his corruption grew." Hayes's head dropped into his hands. He didn't weep, but his shoulders shook. Wolfe closed his eyes, dismissing him. "Inspector, take him. His crimes are financial, not mortal, but they merit reckoning." Kramer muttered under his breath, but rose. "Fine. He'll answer for fraud. But don't expect me to thank you, Wolfe. You're a thorn every time." "Better a thorn," Wolfe murmured, "than a blindfold." Kramer yanked Hayes up and marched him out. The door shut, leaving the office quiet again. Wolfe opened his eyes. heavy with the weight of his own certainty. So, the banker's double life is no more. Zimmerman is dead, Talbot is caged, Hayes is exposed. That leaves only us, Archie. I stretched, letting out a long breath, and thank heaven for that. I was beginning to think Gotham's entire financial district was going to end up in Fritz's kitchen. Wolfe's lips curved, not quite a smile. Archie, money corrupts, but it is fear and hunger that kill. He reached for his beer, lifted it, and sipped. The case was nearly tied off, but I knew Wolfe well enough to see he had one more line to deliver before it was done, and when it came, it would close the book on the banker's double life for good. When the door shut behind Kramer and Hayes, the brownstone felt like it had exhaled. Fritz disappeared toward the kitchen, and Wolfe leaned back in his chair, shutting his eyes with the serenity of a man who had just pulled weeds out of a stubborn patch of earth. I stayed where I was, because I knew he wasn't done. He never was until he had chewed the marrow. "You're still thinking," I said, watching his lips purse the way they do when he's squeezing logic until it squeals. "Talbot's the killer. Hayes is the enabler. That's all tied up. What's left to think?" Wolfe opened his eyes slowly. "What remains, Archie, is the matter of motive. Not merely the superficial. Fear, ambition, self-preservation. Those are obvious. What must be examined is why Zimmerman invited his own destruction." "He didn't exactly invite it," I said. "Unless waving ledgers full of other people's money counts as sending out invitations." "Precisely," Wolfe murmured. "Zimmerman was not an imbecile. He must have known his concealments were untenable. Yet he persisted, and more, he scheduled a meeting days before his death, intending to collect. That was not the act of a man resigning to despair. That was a man confident of leverage. What, then, altered that confidence into catastrophe? I rubbed my jaw. Maybe Talbot convinced him the game was over. Maybe Hayes threatened to spill unless Zimmerman stopped. Any number of things. Pfui, generalities. Wolfe's hand cut the air like a cleaver. We must be precise. The specific fact that shattered Zimmerman's balance is not yet identified. That was Wolfe at his best, turning a corpse into a chess problem. I had to admit it made me curious. Zimmerman thought he had a shield, and suddenly it turned into a target. Something had shifted, and Wolfe was determined to name it. He ordered me to fetch the ledgers again. I laid them out, and he studied them in silence, the lamplight gleaming off the columns of figures. His finger traced one entry, paused, then moved on. He stopped again near the back, where the handwriting grew more hurried. He tapped. "Archie. This withdrawal. 2 days before Zimmerman's death. $10,000. Destination unrecorded." I leaned over. That's not unusual. He skipped details all over these pages. "Not here," Wolfe said. "Here, in this section, every other entry is meticulous. Names, dates, amounts. Except this one. Why? Maybe he didn't have time to write it down. Phooey. Zimmerman had time to lead 2 lives. He had time to jot an account." Wolfe sat back, eyes narrowing. "This sum, unexplained, may represent the fulcrum. If we locate its destination, we may learn why Zimmerman's confidence collapsed." That was my cue to groan, because it meant more legwork. Wolfe called it locating the destination. I called it running my shoes thin while shady clerks pretended not to recognize handwriting. But I knew when the trail mattered, and this one did. The next morning, Saul joined me again. We started with the smaller outfits Zimmerman had touched, working our way through bookkeepers and managers who tried hard to look clean. It took hours, but by late afternoon, we struck gold at a brokerage tucked between a tailor and a pawn shop. A nervous little man with a green visor fidgeted when I showed him Zimmerman's scrawl. "Yes," he admitted. "Zimmerman placed a deposit, 10,000, but not under his own name. He used an alias, said it was urgent, private." "What alias?" I asked. The man coughed. "Victor Talbot." That name landed like a hammer. Saul and I exchanged a glance, and I could already hear Wolfe's grunt of satisfaction. By the time I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was at his desk, orchids ignored, a fresh bottle of beer sweating beside him. I dropped the report and said, Zimmerman funneled the 10 grand into an account under Talbot's name 2 days before he died. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. So, Zimmerman was no longer merely shielding Talbot. He was buying him. That sum was a ransom, payment for silence. Zimmerman believed he could purchase his safety, but he misjudged. Talbot accepted the money, then ensured Zimmerman could never demand it back. I whistled. That's cold, even for a banker. It is inevitable, Wolfe said. Men like Talbot see money as both means and end. Zimmerman was useful while he enabled. Once he threatened exposure, he became expendable. Talbot collected the ransom and erased the creditor. I shook my head. And Hayes? Just a dupe who let his name get borrowed until it ruined him? Not merely a dupe, Wolfe said. A coward. He permitted duplicity to flourish around him and thus bears guilt. But he is not the killer. That distinction rests solely with Talbot. Before I could respond, the bell rang. Fritz answered, and a moment later, Kramer stormed in, red-faced and smoking fury. He slapped the back of the red chair with his palm. Wolfe, damn you! Talbot's screaming for a lawyer, says you set him up, says the bartender's lying, the ledger's forged. My men are sick of being jerked around. Wolfe didn't flinch. Sit, Inspector. Kramer didn't sit. If you've got something solid, give it to me. If not, I'll toss this case in the river and let Talbot swim out. Wolfe lifted the slip of paper I'd brought back from the brokerage. Here, Zimmerman's final deposit, under Talbot's own name. $10,000. Proof that Zimmerman sought to buy his silence, and proof that Talbot took the money and then silenced him forever. Kramer snatched it, glared at it, and chewed his cigar down to a stump. If this holds up, Talbot won't be swimming anywhere but Sing Sing. It will hold, Wolfe said. The handwriting matches. The broker confirms. Your case is complete. Kramer grunted, stuffed the paper into his coat, and leveled a glare at Wolfe. One day you'll overstep, and when you do, I'll be waiting. Wolfe closed his eyes. Pfui. Kramer stormed out, door slamming behind him. Silence returned, thick and satisfying. I let out a breath and said, So Zimmerman thought he could buy peace. Instead, he bought a bullet. That's one expensive miscalculation. Indeed, Wolfe said. He reached for his beer, lifted it, and sipped slowly. Thus ends the illusion of safety. Money cannot purchase fidelity. It can only delay betrayal. I grinned, and it bought us another case solved. Shall I send Gotham National a bill or just charge them by the corpse? Wolfe sighed, heavy and final. Archie, please. I chuckled, leaned back, and let the room settle into the quiet of a job nearly finished. The threads were pulled tight now, only the final knot left for Wolfe to tie. The night after Kramer stormed out, Wolfe stayed in his chair longer than usual, silent, the lamplight throwing shadows over his face that made him look carved in stone. I half expected him to call it finished, with Talbot sitting under guard and Hayes headed for a hearing, but Wolfe wasn't the type to leave even a loose thread dangling where it might snag him later. He finally broke the silence. Archie, the peril of this case is not whether Mr. Talbot is convicted. It is whether Gotham National Bank survives the exposure. Exposure, I said, leaning back in my chair. You mean the ledgers? Precisely. If they reach public hands, confidence will collapse. Depositors will stampede, investors will retreat. The ruin of one institution may cascade into many. That is not my concern, but it is a reality. Mr. Hayes brought me this problem because he feared that outcome more than Zimmerman's death, and that fear drove him into complicity. Yeah, I said. Fear drove him, ambition drove Talbot, greed drove Zimmerman, and you're sitting here driving me crazy." Wolfe allowed the faintest twitch of a lip. "Patience, Archie. We are near the end. Tomorrow, all who remain must return. The inspector will attend, and I will speak. The truth, whole and indivisible. When Wolfe promised a finale, you could set your watch by it." The next evening, the brownstone was busier than a hotel lobby. Fritz ushered in Kramer first, still chewing cigars like he meant to kill them. Then Hayes, wan and resigned, summoned once more to the place where Wolfe had shredded him. Last came Saul Panzer, not a suspect but a witness, his calm presence as steady as ballast. Wolfe had insisted he be there. Proof, Wolfe said, must be supported by a man whose word was unquestionable. The room settled. Wolfe sat behind his desk, mountain-like, eyes half closed. He didn't look at any of them until Fritz closed the door. Then he spoke, voice slow and deliberate, each word laid like a brick. "Mr. Zimmerman's double life has been revealed in full. He conducted clandestine accounts, concealed fraud with the aid, willing or otherwise, of Mr. Hayes, and permitted Mr. Talbot to siphon funds in exchange for silence. In the end, he sought to ransom his exposure with $10,000 deposited under Mr. Talbot's name. For that miscalculation, he was killed." Hayes shifted, muttering, "I never—" But Wolfe didn't turn his head. "You, Mr. Hayes, were complicit. You surrendered your name, your position, and your integrity to Zimmerman's schemes. You lacked the courage to stop him, and so you became his accomplice in fraud. That cowardice has now delivered you to the law." Kramer grunted approval, though he clearly wanted Wolfe to get to the point faster. Wolfe ignored him, turning his gaze to Talbot's empty chair. "Mr. Talbot, though absent, requires no defense. His guilt is inevitable. He accepted the ransom, silenced Zimmerman with his own revolver, and left the body arranged to suggest suicide. But the angle betrayed him. The smudged prints betrayed him, and his ambition betrayed him most of all. He believed removing Zimmerman would elevate him, when in truth it doomed him. He will rot for it." Kramer barked, "You're giving speeches again, Wolfe. The DA has enough. What I want to know is if we're done." "Done?" Wolfe's voice sharpened. "No, Inspector. Not until the moral balance is stated. This case is not merely about one man's death. It is about duplicity, the human impulse to split oneself, to live two incompatible lives. Zimmerman's folly was in thinking he could balance them indefinitely. Mr. Hayes's folly was in believing cowardice could shield him. Mr. Talbot's was in believing ambition could erase consequence. Each folly led to ruin." The room fell quiet. Even Kramer stopped chewing his cigar. Wolfe closed his eyes, lifted his chin, and concluded. "Zimmerman's double life is ended. The bank may stagger, but it will not collapse, for the truth has been contained. Justice will proceed, not perfect, but sufficient, and so this case is finished." He opened his eyes, heavy-lidded but final, and reached for his beer. That was Wolfe's gavel. Case closed. Kramer stood, muttering, "One of these days, you'll drown in your own words, Wolfe. Till then, I'll take what I can." He yanked the door open and left, the echo of his steps fading down the hall. Hayes rose slowly, pale as milk, his face hollow. "I'll face the board," he whispered. "If the bank survives, it will be by grace, not merit." He turned, collected his coat from Fritz, and left without another word. That left only Saul, silent as ever. He nodded once to Wolfe, once to me, and slipped out, efficient as a shadow. The office was ours again. Wolfe drained his glass, set it down, and sighed. "Archie." "Yeah, boss. Bring me another beer, and then leave me." I did both. When I returned from the kitchen, he was already deep in his chair, eyes closed, the weight of the world on his stomach. I set the glass on the desk and didn't bother saying good night. Upstairs, when I finally kicked off my shoes, I thought about Zimmerman, a man who thought he could live two lives balance two worlds, and keep them both afloat. He ended up on the wrong side of a revolver, betrayed by the very hunger he thought he could manage. That was Wolfe's point, though he'd never spell it out like I just did. Men don't get two lives. They get one. And if they try to cheat it, there's always someone waiting to collect. I came down the next morning to find Wolfe already stationed in his chair, which was unusual enough to make me raise an eyebrow. Fritz said he'd been there since 7, sipping beer and staring at the orchids like they were withholding evidence. Wolfe doesn't stir before breakfast unless something's grinding his brain, and it was clear Zimmerman's ghost was still at work upstairs. The papers were no help. They stuck to the suicide line, complete with somber phrases about personal despair and unforeseen tragedy. Talbot's name didn't appear, which meant Kramer was still keeping things under wraps while he stitched the case together for the DA. The reporters would catch up soon, but for now, Gotham National could pretend their pillars were unshaken. I laid the paper down and said, "Looks like the city bought the suicide story wholesale. You going to correct them?" "No," Wolfe said, closing his eyes. "The truth will surface in its time. My task is not to tidy public illusions, but to identify reality." "Which you've done," I reminded him. Talbot pulled the trigger. Hayes held the ladder. Zimmerman fell off it. End of song. Wolfe opened one eye and aimed it at me. "You persist in haste, Archie. Yes, Talbot's guilt is certain, and Hayes's cowardice undeniable. But the essence of this case lies deeper. Why did Zimmerman, who thrived for years on duplicity, suddenly stumble? What altered his equilibrium?" I shrugged. Maybe the 10 grand he forked over bought him a week of peace, and Talbot decided a bullet was cheaper. "Pooh. That is motive, not essence," Wolfe said. "Zimmerman believed he could purchase survival, but survival cannot be bought. That is the fulcrum of his undoing. Still, one piece remains." He tapped the ledgers, stacked neatly on his desk. "This ledger of withdrawals and false initials is complete in its pattern. But the pattern must be declared. Tonight we will summon Mr. Hayes once more. Inspector Kramer will attend, and the truth will be spoken. Entire, inevitable, and inescapable." That was Wolfe for you, never satisfied with just a conviction. He had to pronounce the law of human folly like a judge in his private court. And I knew better than to argue when he said, "Tonight." Fritz was already preparing the dining room for another unwelcome guest. By evening, the brownstone had that tense, loaded air again. Kramer arrived first, chewing on a cigar that had already given up hope. He didn't sit until Wolfe gestured at the red chair, and even then he glared like a man forced to eat spinach. Then came Hayes, pale and drawn, his suit sagging as if it carried the weight of the bank on its shoulders. Fritz relieved him of his coat and guided him in, and Hayes sat opposite Wolfe with the resignation of a man who'd stopped fighting. Wolfe began without preamble. "Mr. Hayes, Mr. Zimmerman's duplicity did not spring full-grown from his mind. It flourished because men like you permitted it. You signed, you looked away, you allowed your name to shield his schemes." Hayes's voice cracked. I had no choice. He threatened me, threatened the bank." "You had choice," Wolfe said coldly. "You chose cowardice, and cowardice is complicity." Kramer growled. "We've heard this lecture. What about the killing?" Wolfe ignored him. "Talbot killed Zimmerman. That is established. But Talbot acted only because Zimmerman threatened disclosure. And Zimmerman threatened only because he believed Mr. Hayes would not withstand exposure. Thus, Mr. Hayes, you were the fulcrum. Without you, there is no collapse." Hayes sagged in the chair, his hands limp in his lap. "Then I am ruined," he whispered. "Yes," Wolfe said. "Ruined not by murder, but by weakness. That is your punishment, and it will suffice." The silence hung thick, until Kramer stood, snapping his notebook shut. "Fine, Wolfe. You've had your sermon. Talbot goes to trial, Hayes gets the boardroom firing squad, and I get another headache. Satisfied? No, Wolfe said, opening his eyes. Not until the truth is declared in full. Tomorrow, Inspector, you and Mr. Hayes will return. I will state it once, for all, without ambiguity. Then the matter is ended. Kramer muttered something unrepeatable, but he didn't argue. He yanked open the door and stalked out, leaving the smell of tobacco and frustration behind him. Hayes followed, his steps dragging as if Wolfe's words had turned his legs to stone. When the door closed, I leaned back and said, "So that's the setup for your grand finale. You going to make it sound like scripture?" "Pfui," Wolfe murmured. "I will make it sound like truth." And that was all I got out of him. He reached for his beer, closed his eyes, and let the house fall into silence again. I knew better than to press. When Wolfe promised to close a case with a final word, the next evening was going to end with a hammer blow. The next evening the brownstone was weighted down with the kind of silence that makes the walls lean closer. Fritz had polished the brass in the front hall and set out the chairs in Wolfe's office as if we were expecting royalty. But the guests of honor were less than regal. Inspector Kramer, scowling through his cigar smoke, and Edward Hayes, drawn and pale, every inch of him screaming resignation. Wolfe sat behind his desk, immense and immovable, with the ledgers arranged before him like evidence at a tribunal. When the door closed behind Fritz, Wolfe opened his eyes and began, his tone calm as a gavel. "Gentlemen, the matter of Paul Zimmerman's death concludes tonight. It is not suicide, not accident, but murder. That is now beyond question." Kramer grunted. "We've got Talbot for that. He cracked, admitted it. What's left to say?" "Everything," Wolfe replied. "Talbot's hand pulled the trigger, yes, but a hand is guided by a will. To understand why Zimmerman died, one must understand why he lived as he did." He tapped the ledgers, thick fingers pressing the truth into the desk. Zimmerman lived a double life. One public, one concealed. He siphoned funds, forged accounts, shielded vice behind the veneer of a banker's respectability. Such duplicity is not sustained alone. It required collaborators. Mr. Hayes, you were one. Your name, your position, your silence. These permitted Zimmerman to prosper in his deceit. Hayes shook his head, voice trembling. "I was threatened. He coerced me. You yielded." Wolfe cut in, soft but cutting. "Threat is common to all men. Choice remains. You chose cowardice, and cowardice is complicity." Kramer shifted irritably. "All right, Wolfe. Hayes is weak. But weakness doesn't make him a killer." "No," Wolfe said, eyes half closing. "He did not kill. He merely tilled the soil in which murder grew." Talbot, on the other hand, saw advantage. Zimmerman pressed him for silence, offered him ransom, $10,000 deposited under Talbot's name. Talbot took the money, but money never buys fidelity. It only postpones betrayal. Talbot decided the surest silence was a corpse. He staged suicide, but the angle of the shot, the smudged prints, and the bartender's testimony exposed him. He is guilty of the act. Hayes covered his face with his hands. Kramer puffed, chewing his cigar to pulp. Wolfe pressed on, his voice rising only enough to command the room. Thus we have the triangle entire. Zimmerman, devoured by his own duplicity. Talbot, consumed by ambition. Hayes, paralyzed by fear. Each destroyed himself in turn, one by corruption, one by violence, one by cowardice. That is the inevitable arithmetic of deceit. The silence that followed was dense enough to stop breath. Finally, Kramer stood, pocketing his notebook. "Well, Wolfe, you've had your say. Talbot will swing for murder, Hayes will answer for fraud, and Gotham National can patch its leaks. You always have to make it sound like scripture, don't you?" "Pfui," Wolfe murmured. "Not scripture. Truth." Kramer growled, jammed his hat on, and left, trailing smoke and indignation. Hayes followed, sagging under the weight of his ruin, Fritz shadowing him to the door with the silent dignity only Fritz could manage. When the hall was quiet again, the brownstone exhaled, and Wolfe leaned back in his chair. He reached for his beer, lifted it, and sipped, his eyelids drooping with the satisfaction of inevitability delivered. "Archie," he said at last, "record this well. A man cannot be two men. Duplicity is a debt that collects itself." Zimmerman thought he could live as both pillar and parasite. He was wrong. His end was inevitable. I leaned back, grinning. So the banker bought himself 2 lives and couldn't afford either. Remind me never to apply for a loan at Gotham National. Wolfe's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but enough to tell me the case was closed. He raised his glass once more, and I left him there, satisfied in his chair. The brownstone returned to order.